1492, Colon touches land, the world changes forever. But there is a story that almost no one tells. A story that occurred decades before the English set a single foot in North America. A story of a man who explored, conquered and named lands that today millions of people call home, without knowing that it was a Spaniard who discovered them first. His name was Juan Ponce de León, and what he did changed the map of the world. Before talking about him, we need to understand the moment in which he lived, late 15th century. Spain has just completed the Reconquista, that process of almost 800 years in which the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula recovered their territory inch by inch. Village by village, battle by battle, the Spaniards of that generation were not men of the desk. They were men hardened in war, raised with the idea that glory is won on horseback and with the sword in hand. They were men who did not know fear, or at least had learned to live with it. And suddenly, in 1492, an unknown continent appears, a new world. What do you think that generation of warriors did when the door to the unknown opened? They launched themselves without a safety net, without maps, without knowing what they would find on the other side. Juan Ponce de León was one of them. He was born around the year 1474. Although the exact date remains a subject of debate among historians, his most probable birthplace is Sant Bas de Campos. In the province of Valladolid, in the heart of Castile, his origins were noble, although modest. He belonged to a Hidalgo family, which meant he had lineage blood, but not necessarily a fortune to back it up. In that Spain that was perfectly normal, many of the great conquerors came exactly from there, from families with a name, but without gold. Men who needed to earn their own destiny with their own hands. From a young age, Ponce de León served as a page in the court of Aragon. He learned the codes of the nobility, the arts of war and the diplomacy that was breathed in the hallways of power. He participated in the last campaigns of the Reconquista when Granada fell in January of 1492. He was there forming part of that generation that saw a historical cycle close and another completely new one open. Subscribe to the channel if you want to continue discovering the history of Spain that they did not teach you in school. There is much more to tell. When Colon returned from his first voyage with news of lands on the other side of the ocean, all of Spain held its breath, and when the admiral undertook his second voyage in 1493, Juan Ponce de León was in that fleet. He was about 19 years old. He was young, ambitious, and was about to see things that no European had ever contemplated. That second voyage was completely different from the first. They were no longer 3 ships and the uncertainty of the unknown. Colon was returning with 17 ships and more than 100 men with the intention of establishing the first permanent colony in the New World. La Española, the island that today shares Haiti and the Dominican Republic, was going to become the first experiment of European colonization in America, and that experiment, as expected, was chaotic, violent, and extraordinarily difficult. Ponce de León learned in that environment. He learned to negotiate with the indigenous peoples, to read the territory, to survive in conditions that would have destroyed any less prepared man. La Española was a hotbed of conflicts between Spaniards and Tainos, between the colonizers themselves who disputed power and influence, and between the diseases that decimated everyone equally. It was a brutal but effective school. During the following years, Ponce de León was earning a reputation. He was known for his military effectiveness, for his ability to maintain peace with the indigenous communities when possible, and for his loyalty to the crown. These were not minor virtues in an environment where treason and opportunism were common currency. In the year 1504, he received an encomienda in the east of La Española, in the region of Hué. There he proved to be not only a warrior, but also a capable administrator. He established order, founded a town, organized production. That is why, when rumors of a nearby island called Borinquen arrived, rich in gold and unexplored, the colonial authorities thought of him. That island was what we know today as Puerto Rico. In 1506, with informal permission from the authorities, Ponce de León crossed the channel that separated La Española from Borinquen with a small expedition. What he found surprised him. The island was fertile, beautiful, and its inhabitants, the Tainos, were not hostile. In principle, Ponce de León established contact with the cacique Ibana, one of the most influential leaders of the island, and negotiated a relationship of cooperation that allowed him to explore the territory without immediate confrontations, and he found gold. Not in quantities that would make the treasures of the Incas that would arrive later blush, but enough to confirm the potential of the island. He returned to La Española with samples and with a favorable report. The colonial authorities gave him the green light to return and establish a permanent settlement. In 1508, Juan Ponce de León became the first governor of Puerto Rico, the first Spanish authority on that island, the man who laid the foundations of what would take centuries of history. He founded the Villa de Capara, the first permanent European settlement in Puerto Rico. He organized the extraction of gold, established relations with the local caciques, and began the process of integration that characterized the Spanish colonization. It was not a process without tensions because no conquest process was. But Ponce de León stood out among his contemporaries for trying to govern with a certain order and a certain legality within the parameters of his time. However, colonial politics was implacable. Diego Colón, son of the admiral, claimed the governorship of all the territories discovered by his father, including Puerto Rico. The legal disputes that opened in Spain deprived Ponce de León of his position as governor. It was a political defeat that would have sunk a less resilient man, but Juan Ponce de León was not one to give up. If they took Puerto Rico from him, he would look for something new, something bigger. And the rumors that circulated among the sailors and the indigenous people of the Caribbean islands spoke of a land to the north. A huge land, a land full of riches. Some said that there existed a fountain whose waters had the power to return youth to whoever drank them. The fountain of youth. We must be careful here with history, because that legend is more a later construction than a documented obsession of Ponce de León. The chronicles that mention that search are late, written decades after his death, and modern historians have shown that the main motivation of the civilian explorer was not the myth, but something much more concrete: new lands, riches, glory, and above all to recover the political weight he had lost. In 1512, Juan Ponce de León obtained from King Fernando the Catholic the capitulation that authorized him to explore and colonize the island of Bimini, a land that the indigenous people vaguely located to the north. The Spanish crown worked like that. The explorer put up the risk, the money, and the men, and if he succeeded, he received titles, lands, and recognition. It was a system that drove exploration with an energy that no other European power could match at that time. In February of 1513, Juan Ponce de León set sail from Puerto Rico with 3 ships. The expedition was modest in number, but enormous in ambition. They sailed north following the indications of the most experienced pilots and the intuition of a man who had been sailing the waters of the Caribbean for more than 15 years. On March 27, 1513, Easter Sunday, in the Spanish liturgical calendar, they sighted an unknown coast. On April 2nd, they disembarked and took official possession of the territory in the name of the Crown of Castile. Ponce de León stuck the royal standard on that beach and pronounced the required words. That piece of land had just become part of the Spanish Empire, and he gave it a name. He called it La Florida, in honor of the Pascua Florida. Yes, but also because the land they had before their eyes was covered with flowers. Lush and green, absolutely different from the arid islands of the Caribbean they had left behind. Pause. Understand what just happened. We are in the year 1513. The English will not arrive in North America until almost a century later, the Jamestown colony, which Anglo-Saxon history books present as the first settlement in North America, would not be founded until 1607. 94 years have to pass from this moment for an Englishman to set foot on the land that Ponce de León has just discovered. Spain arrived first. It is not an opinion. It is a documented historical fact. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button. It helps us more than you imagine to keep telling these stories. The expedition continued to explore the coast. They sailed south following the coastline, discovering a completely new geography. They found the Gulf Stream, that oceanic phenomenon that would later become the natural highway for all the ships that crossed the Atlantic back to Europe. His pilot, Antonio de Alaminos, was the first to understand the nature and utility of that current, a nautical discovery of incalculable consequences for the future of transatlantic navigation. But La Florida was not Bimini. Ponce de León had not found the island of the legend. He continued looking. He circled the southern tip of the peninsula, where the Florida Keys are today, that necklace of small islands that enters the ocean like a finger pointing towards Cuba. There the encounters with the Calusa indigenous people were violent, unlike the Taínos of the Caribbean. The Calusa were formidable warriors who had fought against numerous incursions and had no interest in peacefully receiving the newcomers. Ponce de León tried to establish contact, but the Calusa attacked with force. There were casualties on both sides. The expedition retreated and continued its exploration to the north before heading back to the islands. The first trip to La Florida ended without Ponce de León having been able to establish any permanent settlement. But the discovery itself was of extraordinary magnitude. He had given a name to what today is the state of Florida and had probably set foot on land in what is today territory of the United States of America, with almost a century in advance with respect to any other European from the north of the continent. He returned to Spain to account for his discovery to King Fernando. The reception was positive. Ponce de León was received with honor at court. Fernando the Catholic died in 1516, but his successor, the young Carlos, who would soon be the powerful Carlos I of Spain and the fifth of the Holy Roman Empire, confirmed the titles of Ponce de León and entrusted him with the official colonization of La Florida and Bimini. However, Between official recognition and the royal expedition several years passed, Ponce de León had other commitments. The Caribbean remained a troubled region that required attention, and organizing a colonization expedition was a logistical enterprise considerably more complex than an exploration expedition. He needed ships, men, supplies, weapons, domestic animals, seeds, construction tools. It was in essence setting up a society from scratch in unknown territory. Meanwhile, other Spanish explorers continued to expand the map. Hernán Cortés began the conquest of Mexico in 1519. The news of the riches of the Aztec Empire reached all corners of the Spanish world and unleashed a fever of expeditions that had no precedent in history. The New World was no longer a geographical curiosity, it was the setting for the greatest feats of modern history. In that context, Ponce de León organized his second expedition to La Florida. In 1521 he departed with 2 ships, 200 men, horses, pigs, cattle, farming tools, and everything necessary to found a permanent colony. His intention was clear: to establish a settlement on the western coast of the peninsula and from there expand the Spanish presence towards the interior. They disembarked probably in the area of current southwest Florida in Calusa territory, and the Calusa, who had not forgotten the previous encounter, received them exactly as Ponce de León should have expected, with arrows. The attack was devastating. The Spaniards resisted, but the numerical superiority of the Calusa warriors and the ferocity of their assault caused numerous casualties in combat. An arrow reached Juan Ponce de León in the thigh. The wound seemed manageable at first, but in the 16th century any wound could become deadly, and this was no exception. The expedition retreated to Cuba. There in Havana, Juan Ponce de León died from the wounds received in battle in July of the year 1521. He was approximately 47 years old. He dies in Cuba, far from the Florida he had discovered, far from the Spain that had trained him, far from Puerto Rico where he had governed, but not in oblivion, although for a long time it seemed so. Who was Juan Ponce de León really? That is the question that must be answered before finishing this story, because there is an enormous distance between the real man and the character that the following centuries built. The real Ponce de León was a man of his time, a Castilian nobleman who grew up with the values of the Reconquista, who understood the world in terms of faith, crown and honor. He was not a philosopher or a humanist. He was an explorer and a soldier, and one must judge him within that historical context. Not with the parameters of the 21st century, he was also a man of remarkable capacity. He arrived in the New World with no more resources than his name and his sword, and in less than 20 years he became governor of an island, discoverer of a subcontinent, and a recognized figure in the Spanish court. That was not achieved by a mediocre man. His methods in Puerto Rico were the usual ones of the Spanish colonization of the time, with everything that implies. The relationship with the indigenous peoples was marked by moments of cooperation and moments of conflict, as happened in practically all the territories colonized in that period, but within the parameters of his time. Ponce de León was considered a capable and relatively orderly administrator. The figure of the brutal and bloodthirsty conqueror that appears in a certain simplified narrative does not correspond to what the historical documents say about him. His geographical discoveries, however, are indisputable. La Florida, the state that today houses more than 21 million people, bears the name he gave it, the Gulf Stream, which his pilot Alam Minos mapped for the first time, became one of the most important maritime routes in history. And the simple fact of having set foot in North America in 1513 places him in history with an earliness that no other European explorer in that territory can claim. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring the real history of Spain and the Hispanic world. There are centuries of exploits waiting to be told, but there is something else that is worth analyzing. Because the Florida of Ponce de León was not an isolated episode. It was the beginning of a Spanish presence in North America that lasted almost 300 years. And that left traces that persist to this day in names, architecture, language, and culture. After Ponce de León, other Spanish explorers continued the work. In 1528, Pamfilo de Narvaez led an expedition to La Florida that ended in tragedy, although the most notable survivor of that venture, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, completed one of the most extraordinary exploration trips in history. 8 years traveling on foot through the south of what today are the United States, from the coast of Texas to the north of Mexico, becoming the first European to explore that vast interior territory. In 1539, Hernando de Soto undertook the most systematic exploration of the interior of North America that had been carried out until then. He traveled through what today are the states of Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas. He was the first to cross the Mississippi River, that fluvial giant that divides the North American continent in 2 halves. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado in 1540 explored what today are the states of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Kansas, looking for the legendary 7 cities of Cibola. He did not find the cities of gold. But he explored and mapped an immense territory that no European had seen before, and in 1565, Spain founded San Agustin in La Florida, which would become the first permanent European city of what today are the United States, 42 years before Jamestown. 42 years, all this immense effort of exploration, of cartography, of foundation of cities, and of establishment of institutions, began with the man who on the Pascua, Florida of 1513 stuck a Spanish standard on a beach of what we today call Florida and gave a name to that land. Juan Ponce de León did not find any fountain of youth. That is a myth. What he found was something more real and more lasting, a subcontinent, and he did it almost a century before anyone else tried. The Anglo-Saxon narrative of the history of North America tends to start in Jamestown in 1607. It is understandable from the point of view of those who wrote that narrative, because Jamestown was the origin of the English-speaking America, but it is a simplification that makes decades of Spanish exploration invisible. It is like telling the history of Europe from the 11th century and ignoring everything that happened before in Greece and Rome. The reality is that when the English arrived in Jamestown, the south of what today are the United States had been explored, mapped and partially colonized by Spain for almost a century. San Agustin had 42 years of existence. Santa Fe in New Mexico would be founded only 2 years after Jamestown, in 1610. The map of that territory already had Spanish names in dozens of rivers, valleys, mountains, and geographical features. Those names survived Florida, California, Nevada, Colorado, Montana, Arizona, New Mexico, Rio Grande, Sierra Nevada, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, Sacramento, El Paso, San Antonio, Cape Canaveral, which in its roots carries the Spanish Canaveral. They are Spanish names in the heart of North America, silent testimonies that there was a presence before the one that is usually told, and behind all those names, behind all that history, there is a man who set sail from Puerto Rico in February of 1513 with 3 ships and the determination to find something new. A Hidalgo of Castile who did not know he was about to write his name in the history of the youngest continent in the world. Juan Ponce de León did not die knowing that he had discovered what one day would be one of the most populous states of the most powerful nation in history. He died in Cuba with an arrow stuck in his thigh and the dream of La Florida unfinished. But what he left behind was already indelible. The states, the names, the routes, the current that for centuries served as an oceanic highway to the ships that crossed the Atlantic. The demonstration that North America was not a territory without European history before the English. All that is his legacy. There is a statue of him in San Juan de Puerto Rico. There is another in St. Augustine, Florida. And there is a county in Georgia that bears his name. Small recognitions for a man whose footprint is in reality continental. The next time someone tells you that North America was discovered by the English, you already know what to answer. There is a Spaniard who arrived 90 years earlier, a man who was born in Castile, who was hardened in the Reconquista, who crossed the ocean in the second expedition of Colón, who governed Puerto Rico and who in the spring of 1513 disembarked in a land full of flowers and gave it the name that it still bears today. His name was Juan Ponce de León, and he arrived first. If you liked this video, share it with someone who thinks that the history of America starts in 1607. Subscribe so you do not miss the next episodes. There are many more stories of Spain waiting to be told, real, epic, and forgotten stories like this one.